I think I will get started just about now. Many of you may be used to seeing me running around from session to session, but this is actually a talk that I'm giving. So aside from running around and solving tech problems, what I actually do normally as a part of my job is that I work in intervention with Cultic, which is an organization based out of Montreal. We have one half of the organization dedicated to the collection of information in a library dedicated specifically to the topic of cultic phenomena. And the other half of our organization is health services, and that's where I work. So aside from working with clients and helping them find support services and resources, one of the main parts of my job in this area is coordinating support groups. And I would really love to see a greater number of support groups organized around this issue in general. So today, I'm talking about the practical aspects of doing that organizing work. Not so much from the perspective of the facilitators, although there are a couple of the facilitators of the group of the support groups at the conference this week. So if ever you're curious about that aspect of it, I encourage you to talk to my colleague Liz, who's here today, or else Céline Castillo, who's also somewhere around here and who facilitates our French group and who can also chat with you in Spanish if you so desire. But to start, I figured I'd get a little bit into who is InfoCult as an organization and why we started a support group, what led to that decision in the first place. So here's a little timeline of the organization's history, and I'm not going to go into every point of it, but essentially, when it was founded, the organization was first formally founded in 1980 as the Cult Project. At that point in time, the focus was really on public awareness, information, activism, but there was also a lot of requests for consulting and advising. So especially from the family members of people involved in cultic or high control groups who were trying to figure out what approach they should take to the situation with their family member. And so over time, interacting with that public, as well as eventually developing more ties with former members as well, we felt the need to expand our services in the area of the advising that we could offer internally, but realizing the limit of our expertise in that area, then also being able to refer to lawyers, to mental health professionals, and to make sure that people were getting connected to the professionals who could actually follow them in the long term and help them resolve some of the issues they were dealing with. And as a result of this work, especially with mental health professionals, we eventually had some of our volunteers and board members working in mental health remark to us that they were seeing from their work in individual-based therapy with clients that there was a serious need for peer support. And that a peer support, because of especially the isolation that their clients were coping with and feeling like they were the only ones in the world dealing with the kind of problems that they were dealing with, that a support group would be necessary to address that kind of issue. So we first started a support group for former members in 2018. At that point in time, it was in person. It was only in French because the majority of InfoCult's client base are francophones in Quebec, although we do serve all of Canada, and we do also work with Anglophones, and we're a bilingual organization. In 2019, we expanded it and started running a second meeting for Anglophones. And then in 2020, we found the need to move online, which isn't on this slide, but was a pretty substantial turn in the way that these things were organized, and also meant that we were then able to offer services to people from a much wider geographical area than just those who could make it into a particular community center in Montreal. And in 2021, we expanded the service to also offer a separate support group for families and friends, since we were getting a lot of requests from them for peer support, but we we had made the decision already. There are some support groups out there that blend loved ones and former members together in that environment, but we had chosen not to do that. And so it was then a question of starting a second service to address that need. So I'm going to focus a little in today in general on former members and their needs in organizing support groups, because they're the ones who really shape these services for us in the first place. So who the support group is for is people who have experienced or are currently experiencing controlling relationships in general. That's a really large umbrella, and it helps us to, because people come to us and will say, I'm not sure if I was in a cult. I'm not sure if I identify with that, but I really need help. Do you think that this support group is appropriate for me? So then being really clear that what we're interested in are these social relationships in groups, social systems or environments with high commitment, demand, or control, that this is practically what we're talking about, and the shared element that's going to be the basis of that peer support is really how we bridge those gaps. And it allows us to have a certain level of neutrality in the terms that we use. People don't have to come to us self-identifying with a particular idea, whether it's coercive control or religious trauma or cultic abuse. People can both come with whatever terms feel appropriate to them and also evolve in their understandings of their own experiences over time, so long as they still feel that this sort of phenomenological description applies to their experiences. So what are the needs that support groups respond to? First and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, there's the element of breaking isolation. In general, they are also confidential, and so they can then become a safe space for self-expression, where the person doesn't necessarily need to mold their experience to fit someone else's expectations of what their narrative should be, and they can speak freely, or at least that's our aim, that's the ideal. They can hear what has or has not worked for other people dealing with similar situations, and they can also be exposed to diverse perspectives in our support groups, at least in particular because, as was sort of mentioned on the previous slide, it's not group specific. It's not just for people who have come out of a particular ideological or doctrinal environment. So there's then a matter of comparison. Oh, maybe your group functioned in a really different way than mine, but I can still see how the elements of control played out, and there can be some self-discovery in that experience and contact with diversity in that context. It's important to note that because these are peer support groups, they're different from therapy groups. So it's not a situation where we're going to dig in and ask a lot of directed questions at participants. And it's also not it's not an environment where we're going to allow a lot of pressure to be applied to any individual participant in talking about their experiences. It's one where we very much sort of moderate the level of specificity, and then if someone expresses that what they actually need is a therapy group, or maybe what they actually need is more tailored individual therapy, that's something that we can refer to and that we can work with people on. It's just not what this service is. So I wanted to touch a little bit more on this question of diversity and shared experience in designing these services, because I think this is important to consider if ever you're thinking about organizing a peer support group, how you're going to, what box you're going to define around it, who is it for, what kind of experiences do you expect to come up in that environment, how specific or general do you want to go with things? So do you want to be for a specific movement? If so, then you will have an environment where people can talk really in depth about the ideology and the structure of that movement and their particular experiences in that environment, probably a little more in depth than we get into in these general groups. But at the same time, people may feel a pressure to make their telling of their story adhere to what they're hearing from other people participating in that group. So there's a pro and a con there. As I mentioned earlier, there's always this question of having separate or combined meetings for loved ones who are concerned about somebody who's involved in a high control group versus former members of these groups. If you have these groups apart, that means that there will be a clear focus on the problems faced by that part of the public by, for instance, for former members coping in the long terms with their recovery, dealing with trauma, dealing with aspects of control that they're living in their day-to-day lives now, and how that brings up the experiences of control they've had in the past. Whereas family members will generally be more interested in how they relate to the person who's in that group, whether there's a way to get them out, what technique to take, what approach to take in communications with their loved one to try and convince them to leave, is very frequently what comes up. So that's, if you silo those, if you bring them together, there's a particular benefit to those families because they then get insight as to what goes on in these movements, what it's like to live in an environment of high control, and that can really nourish their understanding of what attracted their family member to that environment, what's keeping them in, what's preventing them from leaving in both positive and negative senses. So that can be very positive for them. At the same time, I know I've heard from people who organize these mixed groups with these particular publics that there are benefits for former members as well, being able to share their story and to know that it's helping someone else in this kind of ongoing, difficult, conflictual situation can be positive. But from my perspective, frankly, I see less benefit to the former members than to the family and friends. It's not an equal amount of benefit for the two. And there's also a risk of feeling alienated, feeling like you're not understood in your experience because not everyone you're talking to has actually shared that experience. And you can feel a little bit like a zoo animal in the worst managed version of this kind of scenario. So that's part of what informed our decision to make these separate groups and to give former members a closed space. I think that there's absolutely a space for workshops and for conferences and for these other contexts where people can have these meetings and speak to each other and share these perspectives. But for a peer support group, I like having the peer level be maintained for former members on that level. And then finally, I want to touch a little bit on a subject that I'm pretty sure that everyone has heard a million times before, which is that there is a difference between people who themselves chose to join a group and people who are born or raised in that environment. So I'm not going to dive too far into this subject. If it's something you're unfamiliar with and you'd like more information, please talk to me. I'd be happy to connect you with some readings on this topic. But crucially, for the perspective of organizing a support group, this is not something that we had initially considered when we put together the former members group, but over time it's a need that we've seen arise and that we notice. I think the facilitators as well notice in meetings is sometimes the kind of concerns that are being expressed by people born and raised, the level of incomprehension they have about the group, the kind of resentment and anger that they feel about the choice of their loved ones who brought them into that environment and the powerlessness that they felt in that situation is not necessarily fully shared by people who chose to join that environment. It can also make people who our first generation, so who did choose, feel a certain level of guilt in that choice, which is also not necessarily something that we want to reinforce. So that presents an additional challenge for the facilitators in bridging those gaps in when these conversations are splitting and we're noticing that a certain portion of the group is no longer talking quite as much because they're not necessarily relating to the part of the people who are talking, whether it's first or second generation members in that moment, to be able to ask questions that then draw the silent part of the group in at that moment, that connect to their version of what the other part are talking about, even if it's not perfectly parallel. And taking that kind of deliberate effort. That said, something that we'd be interested to do in the long terms, given the resources in terms of time and personnel, would be to have a separate born and raised group. So not separating out the group that we already have, still having that be a mixed environment, but having a support group where second plus generation members can express themselves and talk about their kind of unique challenges separately, and feel supported in those unique challenges. So next I'm going to talk about the dead, boring elements of this, which is all of the administrative work. So there's a few considerations here that I want people to take quite seriously if ever they are organizing a support group. These elements are organizing the facilitators, planning the sign-up process, ensuring meeting confidentiality, and also considering what the meeting structure itself will be. So first and foremost, our facilitation team, we always aim to have 2 facilitators in any given meeting. Because it's a lot of pressure on each facilitator, so having one person there who has to pay attention to all of the reactions that are happening in the room at any given moment, it's a lot to put on them. But B, what this means is that one person can be attending more to the kind of the basketball pass element of it. Okay, this person just talked, who wants to talk next? Who's getting the microphone next? What's happening from moment to moment? And another person can pay attention to more broadly what is happening in this conversation, what's being said, not just from one person to the next, but over the course of the entire meeting. Are there particular trends that are coming up here, particular larger concerns? And is there anything that we might need to follow up on after the meeting that's particularly concerning in here? So having these 2 perspectives is really helpful for us. On a practical level, sometimes the 2 people are not available. In that case, I often step in on the meetings. I'm always running the technical side of things, but I'll then become the person who's passing the ball back and forth so that the other facilitator can use their professional expertise to keep an eye on the larger conversation and still offer, still participate as they see fit to offer, for instance, sort of psychoeducational reflections. But this is the 2 facilitator thing is always the ideal for us. From time to time, I have heard of people saying, oh, I just run my own group. It's just me. I do it the way I like. When I've tried working with other people, I didn't like the way they did it, so I don't involve other people anymore. And I think, I'm sorry that I've ever heard that. And I think it's a really terrible mindset to take to these things. If you don't get along with another facilitator you're working with, rather than giving up on the endeavor, I'd recommend trying to find another person, or maybe figuring out if you might be the problem, but we'll set that aside. So aside from this, as you see here, our facilitators are volunteers. They generally have professional experience in mental health or in social work, and the goal for them is always to be focused on facilitating the exchanges between the peer participants, so that it's the participants who are getting the time to talk. The focus is on them. The focus is not on the facilitator as an expert or an authority, but their experience and their knowledge in these fields is still really, really valuable to us in actually doing the job properly and being able to recognize when more concerning dynamics are emerging in the support group context. Sometimes the facilitators, as well as being professionals, are also themselves former members, which can be really beneficial because it brings a certain level of empathy to that group and to their engagement in the group. Sometimes I think that can also lead to unhealthy level of empathy and identification with other former members in that environment. And so that's also something as an organizer to be aware of and to be sensitive to, so that you can recognize if there is an emotional attachment that might be harmful to your facilitators, as well as to the participants in that environment. It comes up pretty rarely. I find that former members who are also professionals do bring, I don't want to imply that they don't do wonderful work and that they don't bring a lot to that role. They bring something very unique and genuine to the role. But it is something that then does require a particular sensitivity from organizers who are working with these, especially if they're volunteers, to not be putting so much emotional weight and labor on those volunteers. And finally, for the facilitators, we also have a meeting before the meeting and a meeting after the meeting, so that ahead of time, I can inform them who will be there, what they can expect, if there's going to be new participants, if there is anything concerning that I foresee coming up in the meeting, so that they aren't going into it blind. And then after the meeting, we talk and see whether anything that will need further follow-up afterward has come up. So for instance, sometimes people talk about suicidal ideation in the support group. And we don't want to create an environment where people can't talk about difficult emotions and difficult experiences. But at the same time, so that's okay. And we're not going to tell a person, don't talk about that stuff. But we will follow up with them afterward. I will write them an email afterward to see whether they're receiving additional support outside of the group, or whether there is additional support that we can connect them with or offer them to make sure that their needs are actually being met, and that we're not just letting these kinds of concerning warning signs go in one ear and out the other. So next, the sign-up process. This, for us, it is always quite important to do triage on the requests that we get, because we don't want someone joining the group who we've never seen before, who we know nothing about, whose motivations we don't know. Sometimes to the sign up form, I receive, quite concerning submissions that indicate that the person who wants to be involved in the group, in fact, would like to be told how to start a cult, and would like to learn from former members what will be best in the process of starting a cult. I don't know why you would submit such a thing. Maybe they're troll. It's very likely that this is an internet troll type situation, but regardless, some foresight is necessary. So the entire process for us is free of cost. This is not necessarily true of all support groups. I've heard of some where you need to pay to participate in sessions, and if you can't pay, you need to apply for funding or for permission to join despite lack of funds, where at least this initial sort of intake process is paid, because it does take some amount of time and discernment, some follow-up, some conversations and some research afterward to make sure that the person is who they've represented themselves to be. But because we're a nonprofit organization that is, that is well-funded enough that we're able to offer this service for free, and because we have the great fortune to have volunteers who are willing to give us their time and their sort of professional wisdom in these roles for free, we are really very happy to be able to offer this service in this way, because I'm sure, as everyone here knows, former members of high control groups very frequently do not have deep pockets, and we don't want to ask them to have deep pockets in order to participate. So the sign-up process, I said, necessary screening. It is done through an encrypted form online. The encryption part is really important for me because I want to make sure that the way that we're storing this information is secure, and that if participants ever have these kinds of questions about how secure is their information, how are we protecting them, that I have an actual concrete answer about the measures we are taking to protect their information. It involves a questionnaire and a confidentiality agreement. The questionnaire is pretty basic demographic information in terms of name, age, gender. And then further from that, it's generally, what were your experiences in this group? Are you accessing any other help outside of this? And I use whatever answers are provided there as a springboard for a secondary interview I do with them à vive voix, out loud, so that I can get a further sense of their story and what's concerning to them, what their needs are, what their motivations are, so that I can really understand whether this service is appropriate to them. And in some cases, especially where people are dealing with more severe mental health issues, then for us, it's a matter of asking that they also pursue therapy alongside this service, so that this is not their only lifeline, because it can't serve that level of need. And then finally, if ever I end up, I do these follow-up interviews and so on, if ever I feel that, and then I pass the information along to my colleague, Mike, who has a great deal of experience in this area, to make sure that his judgment of the situation aligns with mine in terms of whether the person is an appropriate candidate for the group. And if both of us are confused at that point, then there are other sources of help that I can turn to for a third opinion to see A, whether it's appropriate, and B, whether there are other services that they should be referred to as well. The confidentiality piece is really important for us since we're online. This also means that we don't want them to be sharing their physical space wherever they're coming to us from with other people. There are times where people are in a living situation where they can't be completely alone. And in that case, what we ask is that they be wearing headphones, so the people who are in their space can't hear what's going on, but also that they set themselves up physically in the room in such a way that the people who are sharing their space can't see their screens, so that not only what's being said, but also anyone who's sharing their videos, that won't be visible to other people who are in the space. And aside from that, we evidently ask that they don't go talking with other people outside of the group about what stories other people shared, that they don't post about it on social media, that they don't record it, so on and so forth. And if we find that people are not honoring this agreement, which we ask that they sign and say that they agree to follow, then that is grounds for us from excluding someone from the service in the future. Generally, if I notice something's off, like if someone's wandering around their background, I'll talk to the person and say, is it possible for you to find a space where, where you're set up in the way that we're asking for? Here's a reminder about confidentiality. But after that point, if they don't, if they can't correct the issue, then we won't continue admitting that person. So the meeting structure, we generally like to keep it relatively loose. The facilitators introduce themselves. We go over some ground rules, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. We invite the participants to introduce themselves as well, although we're very clear that they're not required to. And if they're more comfortable sitting and observing in silence and not responding to people's questions or what have you, that's perfectly fine. I mean, we've done the triage, we've done the filtering, we know who they are. So we feel that it's safe to allow people to go at their own speed in terms of deciding what information they want to share and when. And that helps people feel more safe when they do get to the point where they feel more comfortable talking. Although very often people can sort of start out timid and shy in their first meeting, and by the end of it, kind of get a sense of comfort and feel more comfortable getting involved in the conversation at that point. And I think being flexible in this way is part of what makes that possible. From there, the discussion is free. We sort of say, hey, was there anything from people's introductions that you hooked into, that made you think of something? Or is there something that's happened in the last month that you wanted to talk with us about? And we'll let the conversation unroll from there with gentle pushes in appropriate directions from the facilitators as needed, or questions from the facilitators if the conversation peters out, which it doesn't tend to. And then at the end of the meeting, we do a last go around the table where we ask people how they're feeling, how the meeting has been, if there's anything they'd like to talk about next time for us to make a note of. So the final part of my presentation today is about the question of talking about trauma in a group environment. And I find this particularly important because very often the people who are participating in this support group are doing so because they experience trauma in a group setting. So talking about trauma in a group setting might be re-traumatizing, especially because a number of these groups, some people might have, for instance, come out of therapy groups where their experience in our service might on its face pretty closely resemble what their abusive context was. So being aware of this and being able to, in the structure of the service and from an administrative perspective, create the service in a way that tries to account for and be responsible toward the trauma that people come to us with, I think it's an important consideration, not just for the facilitators, but also for anyone organizing these services. So most of the participants of the support groups view trauma as a totally central aspect of their experience and their motivation for why they need support services. They may have different relationships or proximities to abuse or different types of trauma. So for instance, there may be people who are traumatized because they witnessed abuse. And there are all kinds of complex feelings that can come up around being a witness to abuse. They may be victims directly of abuse, whether it's sexual, whether it's another type of physical abuse, whether it's emotional abuse, or the wide array of different types of things that can come up in the realm of abuses. But in general, what they tend to share is, in particular, identifying with something that looks like what we might call a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, this is distinct from post-traumatic stress disorder in that the complex part means that it happened over a period of time. I think the DSM-5 definition is longer than 6 months. So what this means is that they were in a context that created the grounds for that abuse and that trauma to happen, and it reoccurred over that period of time. So living with that trauma and living with being re-traumatized becomes a part of the person's worldview, and it can impact someone quite differently from a more acute sort of experience of trauma. Then this kind of context of living in a social environment that is traumatic can lead to, as I kind of mentioned earlier, a fear of emotional vulnerability in a group social context. So that definitely informs some of how we frame our ground rules, which I'm going to get into in a moment. It's my next slide. But one last thing that I want to mention is the particular risk of encounters between former members of the same group. There are people who come to us and say, if someone else is from my group, I don't want to participate, you need to tell me in advance. That's a confidentiality issue. Because if I tell you, yes, there is someone from your former group, and your former group only had 20 people in it, as is the case with some of the clients that we work with, then you might very easily be able to pin down who that was. So for me, then, how we handle those situations is that I do assess what was the size of the group that the person came from. Do we think that it is a substantial risk that, and are they from the same region as another participant who would be in conflict with them in this way? How likely is it that this risk will actually allow them to be one where they can identify the particular individual? And then from that point, if I foresee someone being present, then I'll tell them not in advance, but the day of. I don't think you'll want to participate in this particular meeting. But in other cases, we may well have to say, I can't tell you that. So if you feel unsafe with the possibility, then this might not be the support group for you, because this is too great a risk in terms of breaching the confidentiality of another support group participant. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about what are the rules that we use to mediate this environment, and how do they consider the needs of people who are traumatized in this particular way. And I don't expect you to read everything. These are the full set of the ground rules that we read at the beginning of each meeting. But if you're particularly interested in taking a look at them more closely, please write to me. I'd be more than happy to send you my slides. But there's a few elements here. One is repeating. They've already signed the confidentiality agreement at an earlier stage, but every single meeting, we're still going to remind them that this is supposed to be confidential, so that they can keep in mind the needs of that confidentiality agreement, so that doesn't dissipate in the long term. Then we also let people know that in the case that they can leave without justifying themselves to us. And if they want to come back, we'll let them back without demanding an explanation. They don't have to say, I need to go pee, I need to get a drink, anything like that. And what this allows for is if someone is experiencing overwhelming emotions or an anxiety trigger or anything of that nature, they can go and engage in self-care without that spotlight being shone on them, and without them having to justify that to the other participants in the support group. And then if they need further support, they can also write to us and let us know that they'd like to talk to us a little bit after the meeting, or they'd like to have a phone call with me on another day about some element of something that was discussed in the group, and that's always an option. They can always decline to answer questions. We really want to emphasize to people, and we say very clearly that we want them to be in control of their own information and their own story, and they don't have to talk, even if it seems like it would be polite for them to talk at any given moment. We ask them not to engage in individual problem solving, because we don't want someone to emerge as a figure of authority in the group, whether it's a facilitator or another participant. And this does happen from time to time, where people's personalities are just bubbly, they're really a leader type person, whether or not they had that role in their former group. We don't want that to affect the way that participants feel in these meetings, and we don't want them to feel as though they need to subjugate themselves to another person in this context. So that's all for me for the moment. As it turns out, I haven't left a ton of time for questions, but I'd be pleased to take maybe one now, and any further that you want to ask me after this, please don't hesitate to get in touch or to approach me.